humanity across time and place has used cannabis for thousands of years. Like so many other plants and animals, we domesticated it and cultivated it for a variety of uses. While its applications, primarily the use of its fiber in items like rope and textiles, made it commonplace, its medicinal properties have been far less understood, particularly in Europe and the United States. Historically, preparations of cannabis for medical, recreational, and spiritual consumption have been crude: dried flower, sifted resin, the simple solvent extraction. They all shared the benefit, though, of being unadulterated and derived from the whole plant. The introduction of cannabis into the Western pharmacopoeia in the mid-1800s coincided with the rise of patent medicines. The origin of the term snake oil salesman comes from this time as well, where entrepreneurs rushed to create cocktails of bogus, legitimate, and dangerous substances without revealing the ingredients. Cannabis became simply one more component, and the potions and elixirs included other drugs like cocaine, opiates, alcohol, and ether. Simultaneously, the consumption of smoked cannabis in the form of hashish, often mixed with opium, became more and more common. As a result of being incorporated into the overall illicit or unregulated drug trade, cannabis became more racialized and associated with foreign and criminal elements. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 marked the first federal step toward what we now know as prohibition, building on a large number of states that had passed legislation attempting to regulate poisons, as patent medicines and similar unregulated substances came to be regarded. Congress passed a national law requiring labeling and restricting the sale of certain substances. In 1913, California's Poison Act was amended to make the possession and sale of cannabis a misdemeanor crime, before later being made a felony. This happened with the context of the Mexican Revolution, beginning in 1910 and lasting until 1920, which drove many Mexicans to emigrate, fleeing the violence. As has been the cyclical case in the United States, a new generation of immigrants began competing with the previous generation over a limited number of jobs, which has always set the stage for those tensions to be exploited. By propagandizing cannabis as a deadly narcotic that created violent psychosis, closely associating that with a marginalized group, and then fear-mongering over its threat to children in society, politicians and law enforcement found a useful tool to create division and increase their power. The temperance movement in the United States by 1917 had succeeded in getting the U.S. Senate to propose the 18th Amendment, which would constitutionally ban the nationwide sale, importation, exportation, and production of alcoholic beverages. By 1919, 36 states had approved the amendment, which Congress ratified and codified as the Volstead Act in 1920. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States has been mythologized in the rise of the Italian mafia, G-men, and the Untouchables. As a policy, it failed utterly, while creating follow-on effects like empowering organized crime, criminalizing broad swaths of the citizenry, and creating an illicit market that was marked by mass poisonings. As the saying goes, history might not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. As the unpopularity of alcohol prohibition grew, the Assistant Commissioner in the Bureau of Prohibition, Harry J. Anslinger, saw an opportunity to fill a coming void. When alcohol prohibition was repealed finally through the 21st Amendment in 1933, Anslinger was already head of the new Bureau of Narcotics and in the middle of a nationwide campaign to ban cannabis. Over this period between the creation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930 and the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, Anslinger carried out a multi-layered propaganda campaign supported by powerful industrialists, including newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, who saw the threat of hemp paper to his investments in timber and put his media empire to use, boosting Anslinger's messages. Anslinger pushed the same tried and true falsehoods about the dangers of cannabis and explicitly painted it as a threat to public order by intoxicating racial minorities and as the assassin of youth. In addition to coordinating biased newspaper coverage, he supported the creation of other media, including the 1936 film known as Reefer Madness, that lent its name to an entire era of misinformation. In effect, the Marijuana Tax Act created criminal penalties for any use of cannabis without the possession of expensive government licenses in the form of tax stamps. The Tax Act destroyed the domestic hemp industry and was one of the final nails in removing cannabis from mainstream medicine. Even still, the law allowed for some legitimate uses if the steep cost could be met. This began to change when, in 1961, the UN Single Convention on Narcotics created an international framework for controlling a long list of drugs, including putting cannabis in the most restricted category, or schedule. The Single Convention, however, remained unratified by the United States until 1972. In 1969, author and activist Timothy Leary challenged his arrest for cannabis possession at the US-Mexico border. Had the case appealed to the US Supreme Court, who then overturned the Marijuana Tax Act on narrow Fifth Amendment grounds. The Controlled Substances Act was signed into law by President Richard Nixon in late 1970, who then officially declared a war on drugs in June of 1971. Watergate conspirator and Nixon aide John Ehrlichman would later say in a candid moment during a 2016 interview, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The Controlled Substances Act placed cannabis on Schedule 1, which defined the plant as having no medical value and high risk of abuse. One of the most ridiculous, harmful, and scientifically unsupported positions any government has ever taken on an issue. The war on drugs proved profitable to a diverse sector that rose to profit from criminalization, including law enforcement, forced drug testing and treatment interests, and competing substances ranging from alcohol to pharmaceuticals. This constituency backed ever more and punitive measures, and law and order politicians appeared to further their agenda. As the Reagan administration backed harsh mandatory minimums for a wide range of drug offenses in the 1980s, it simultaneously allowed for the importation and sale of cocaine in the US to illegally finance right-wing guerrillas in Central America. It also kick-started the beginning of US mass incarceration, fueled by drug convictions, which has continued to this day, although state-level legalization has significantly reduced new arrests and convictions. This state-sanctioned violence has not been meted out evenly, however. Every stage of cannabis and drug prohibition, the hammer of government deprivation has continuously fallen hardest and most often on Black and Latino Americans. While cannabis prohibition has affected every person who has lived in its borders, its purpose and effect has always been to destabilize and terrorize whatever group the majority wishes to scapegoat. After decades of these laws and the criminalization of millions, which has robbed Americans of everything from the ability to maintain gainful employment to accessing public services, a message of compassion sparked a sea change in drug and cannabis policy. Led by activists and organizers like Dennis Perone and Brownie Mary Rathbun, advocates and supporters in California successfully placed a medical cannabis legalization question on the ballot in 1996, known as Proposition 215, which successfully passed. A distinguishing feature of the Proposition 215 campaign, which became a standard plank in future efforts, was linking the use of cannabis to medicinal effects. In this case, Dennis Perone, a Vietnam veteran and a gay man, pointed to the experience and loss of his partner Jonathan West to AIDS in 1990. At a time when HIV/AIDS was considered a death sentence and its sufferers were incredibly stigmatized, cannabis offered some relief to people who could find very little. Brownie Mary, a hospital volunteer, worked with many terminally ill AIDS and cancer patients who could potentially benefit from cannabis but could not smoke. In response, Mary would infuse butter with cannabis and bake it into brownies, which she supplied for free. What the Proposition 215 campaign accomplished was reestablishing the link between cannabis and medicine, which has spurred over 15 years of successful state medical cannabis referendums. In 2012, Washington and Colorado became the first states to legalize cannabis. In 2018, a provision in the U.S. Farm Bill descheduled hemp, the legal definition of cannabis that contains less than 0.3% THC by weight, and all of its derivatives. While THC in its naturally occurring form in the cannabis plant remains a Schedule I substance, the chemically identical, synthetically derived compound dronabinol became the first cannabinoid drug approved by the FDA in 1985. Since then, the FDA has approved Nabilone, another synthetic cannabinoid similar to THC, as well as the plant-derived CBD drug Epidiolex. By the federal government's own determination, the two primary active constituents of cannabis, THC and CBD, at least in their synthetic forms, have recognized medical value. The tension between prohibition and all the harms it is responsible for over decades, and legalization will not last for much longer. With or without the federal government, more states continue to go their own ways when it comes to regulating cannabis. Recording this before the midterm election in 2022, there are currently 49 states that make at least some medical exception for non or low THC cannabis products. 19 of these states, the District of Columbia, Guam, and the Northern Marianas Islands, have all legalized cannabis for adult use. With all the progress being made across the country, it's important to understand where the cannabis industry currently stands and what still must be done to advance it, which we'll talk about in our next module.